Okay, so this will be our little mini lecture on images, the use of images, and then also narrative. So we're going to go over different types of images and what they're appropriate for, and then we're going to move into a discussion about narrative. It's similar, the narrative portion of the program is similar to what we talked about in English 105, so it'll be kind of a refresher for some of you. Um, but let's go. So we are obviously, again, not going to discuss this because we are not around to discuss things with each other. But think about some of the iconic images that you know. A lot of times in class, when we talk about this, people will talk about the Coca-Cola script or um, the Olympic rings, things of that nature. These are iconic images. You think about what the actual image looks like, what it signifies. Think about why the image is useful as an icon. Like, why is it so iconic? Why does it resonate with us so much? And then think about whether or not this image is the right image for the job. Is it the right image for signifier? So, example, if you want to use the Olympic rings, it makes sense to have Olympic rings, right? Because the Olympics are supposed to be an event that link different cultures and communities and countries together, right? So this image of linked rings, it kind of makes sense. Um, so this is just a jump off point for the rest of this. When you are writing and producing your material, you want to make sure that incorporating images is done appropriately. You want to make sure that you choose the right image, the right type of image to communicate the message that you want to communicate. There's a bunch of different types of images. We're just going to go over a couple. Some of these are like antiquated and we don't use anymore, right? Um, Clip art, line art. I haven't seen clip art, ugh, in forever. Anyways, and word art is not my favorite either. Anyways, here's sending the right message. You want to make sure that when you're considering how you want your audience to react to your message, you're considering how the image is going to work with your story or with your copy to create the type of response that you want in your readers. That's basically the whole point there. Different types of images are going to be good for different types of scenarios, which we'll go through. Make sure that you're looking at affordable art. You get your cheap free stuff. If you're commissioning work or collaborating with other people, it's a pretty good way to get affordable art. Again, just like we talked about a couple of days ago, you want to make sure that your message is clear, and that goes for your images as well. You want your images to be clean and organized without clutter. Make sure that you're giving your readers gutter space or white space where their brains can like get the closure they need to understand your message. And then use words where helpful, especially as far as keying or captioning, things like that. Don't use a lot of confusing elements. Don't be irritating your viewers. Try not to be overly repetitive, complex, or scattered. Um, when you're showing a process, consider different types of images. So, for example, a photo might illustrate your point well when you're showing a process, but there might be little tiny or diminutive images that might come across more clearly through line art. So, if you're thinking about building a table or something from IKEA, or there might be like a little nubbin somewhere that you're not going to see in a photograph very well. So drawing attention to that little nubbin through like line art might be better. So just you know be aware of that. When you're showing a concept, it might be a little more abstracted than a process. So concrete imagery might demonstrate notions better than other images. So line art might be a little too um, abstract as opposed to concrete. So know that. When you're incorporating images, make sure that if you are going to be worldwide, if you're producing your stuff for a worldwide audience, make sure that if you're trying to be funny, that your humor translates. Your little blue book, also, the book that you probably got online, talks about avoiding images that look like stereotypes, but make sure that you're adding diversity. It's a fine line, and your book talks about that. You want to avoid embedded text in a graphic, although I'm seeing this a lot, especially on like newer news websites where they have the headline like written across the actual photograph. For me as an audience member, I'm just throwing that out there, I get confused. I don't know if it's because my eyes are just getting old or what, but like trying to negotiate text inside of a picture is just really difficult for me. And I think it's just a wacky thing to do, but there we go. Make sure your images are always accessible. If you're going to be using tables, graphs, and charts to illustrate your point, make sure that you're using standardized formats, that your tables, graphs, charts are placed consistently, and you aren't going to have like a ton of text because you don't want your audience to be overwrought when they look at your piece. So keep that together. I'll post that. It's a TED Talk by Scott McCloud. If you guys know who Scott McCloud is, that's great. If you don't, he's a comic book guy from the 80s and 90s, and this is a TED Talk that he does about using different media properly as opposed to just taking information and dumping it into a new media. So there's that. You don't have to jot down notes. You don't even have to watch the video if you don't want to. I'm just going to post it for you. So that'll be on today's page too. So that's kind of using images in your piece. Just keep those things in mind. You guys are probably pretty adept at it, and I'm assuming that at this juncture, all of this stuff is pretty intuitive. So there is that. Let's talk about narrative, because that is much more interesting to me anyways. You guys are going to be writing your photo story, so you're going to have to incorporate an image. So all of the aforementioned stuff that we talked about just for the last couple of minutes will be things to consider when you're choosing your image for this and for your instructions project. But more important than the image that you choose is the actual narrative that you compose. So for any writing, you want to make sure that you keep elements of narrative at the forefront of your mind when you're composing. If we're in class, we would be discussing your favorite stories, some of the most memorable openings of books or movies that you've seen or read, and anything from mythology, the Bible, or Shakespeare that you remember vividly. And the reason I ask about those three in particular is because until quite recently, they've been communicators of cultural capital, which has been predominantly Western cultural capital. This is such a better discussion when we're actually in class, so I'm sorry about this, but there it is. In English 101, we talked about the element of narrative style called illusion work, right? I don't know if you guys remember, we read Nick Cave, the essay about how he was little and his dad was giving him all this crazy literature and he was afraid of his imagination. And he referenced a lot of different literature. These references are called allusions. So a lot of times writers will allude to Greek mythology or the Bible or Shakespeare to communicate a point, right? Also, these are stories that are archetypes. If you look at Shakespeare, you have stories like Hamlet. It's an archetypical story. It comes from Shakespeare, and it's the idea that the young prince's father is killed by his uncle, and the uncle usurps the throne, and then the prince has to do something about it. So that's the story of Hamlet, and it has different iterations. It has had different iterations over the years. So it's not just an illusion, it's a story that culturally we go back to over and over again, right? You guys have seen The Lion King. That's just a retelling of Hamlet. So there you go. We like stories for myriad reasons. We like to escape. We like to use stories to entertain each other. We like to use stories to warn each other, to educate each other. We like to tell stories. We use story as a narrative as also a way to chronicle kind of history, right? We have an oral history. And that's one of my favorites is when you get together with your friends or your family and you tell and retell these stories about your family history or about the history of your friendship, right? Um, hey, do you guys remember the time when, right? That's a way of consolidating and perpetuating our own histories. And it's just, I think it's one of the most um, interesting and one of the few truly beautiful things about human beings is that we're able to kind of create and recreate and pass on these stories of our own existence until maybe they reach like mythic stature, like the Odyssey, because that was a story that was told, you know, from one person to another. Homer was just some dude who told the story really well. He never wrote it down. So it's this oral history telling a story. And then eventually we started to write things down. Um, so stories and narratives, they serve a plethora of functions. Think about your favorite elements of a story. Are you a character person? Are you a setting person? Maybe a plot person? I'm a sucker for a good setting. Like, I don't like to admit it, but I'll tell you right, and don't, don't put it out there, but I'll watch Downton Abbey. I will, because you know what? I really like the costumes. Um, and so, I'm a sucker for settings. But maybe you like a character. Maybe you really like a character arc. Or maybe you like a character who's not as dynamic. Maybe you just like watching a character that you can count on to be the same. Maybe you really like plot twists and you're into whodunits and capers and things like that. So, everybody as an audience member likes different things in stories. There are different types of plots in narrative. There's obviously the Aristotelian unified plot. If you make just a triangle with your point your fingers and your thumb, there you go. You've got the Aristotelian unified plot. It's where you have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and that's it. I just like using the word Aristotelian because it's fun to say. Um, Aristotelian. You also have a basic contemporary plot structure, and that's what you probably learned in high school. It looks more like a heart rate monitor where it goes up and down with rising action, and you have a climax and then a denouement and all this stuff. And then some plot lines are linear, go from point A to point Z. They go from the beginning through the middle to the end. And then some are nonlinear, and today we're kind of living in a golden era of nonlinear plot lines where things are, stories are told through flashbacks and um, they're told cyclically. A lot of foreign films are nonlinear. One I can think of is Run Lola Run is a German film wherein she experienced like kind of like Groundhog's Day. She experiences the same day over and over. There's also a movie by Gaspar Noé called Irreversible, which is a particularly disturbing film, but it's the only film I can think of off the top of my head that's been recorded from last scene to first scene. So the first scene you see in this movie is the revenge killing, and then the movie works its way back in plot until you see what they are vengeful for. The initial, it's a really interesting movie. If you guys get a chance, I highly recommend it. It's called Irreversible. It's French. Anyways, and then there's also hyperlink cinema, which is a way to kind of describe the idea that there are multiple plot lines that are happening that may or may not be really connected. An example of hyperlink cinema might be Pulp Fiction, where you have a bunch of different plot lines that are kind of interwoven. Um, and again, that's a very nonlinear plot style because you have Vincent Vega walking into the cafe at the end when you've already witnessed his killing earlier in the movie. Sorry, spoiler alert. Hope you've watched Pulp Fiction before. Anyway, so there's that. Another element of narrative that we can be very interested in might be characters, right? These are some different character types that we have. You've got your protagonist, who's effectively the lead character in a story or a film or whatever. You have the antagonist who works in opposition to that character. Then you have your anti-hero. I know you guys love your Deadpool, right? He's effectively an anti-hero. He might not be a good guy, but he's not necessarily a bad guy, right? Also, Robert De Niro in Heat, that's another example. He's a thief, um, but you really like him, and he tries to do the right thing, even though his motives are good, even though the way he goes about things might not be super above board. You also have a foil character. That's where you have a character who, um, by virtue of who he or she is, they throw into relief characteristics of their protagonist or anti, whoever they are working in opposition to. It's kind of like a juxtaposition. A foil character will draw out qualities in another character. You guys are too young, but there was a movie called Twins with Arnold Schwarzenegger and Danny DeVito, and that is the maybe stupidest example I could give, but it's the one that comes to my mind quickest. Um, when you put Danny DeVito next to Arnold Schwarzenegger, Schwarzenegger looks taller and stronger, and Danny DeVito looks shorter, and those two are foil characters, right? In that movie, Danny DeVito is very street smart, and Arnold Schwarzenegger is very kind of like academically smart. So um, they are put together in juxtaposition to point out these qualities in one another. Another character type is a static character. That's a character that does not change over the course of the story. It stays the same. If you think of characters from Family Guy, those characters are always the same, right? There might be a moment of clarity or lucidity where the character comes around, but then the very next episode, Peter's going to be Peter, right? as opposed to a dynamic character, a character that has a great character arc, or the character changes from the beginning of the story to the end. I know that they've, this whole entire Star Wars nonsense with extra movies and everything, all of a sudden, Darth Vader was like, when I was a kid, Vader was Vader, and he was just bad. I guess you could argue that he kind of is dynamic, and that in the end, he like tries to save Luke, but I don't know. I don't want to talk about Star Wars. Anyway, a dynamic character will change over the course of his or her story arc. So there's that. Uh, excuse me. Other elements of narrative, you've got conflict. Premise and backstory are kind of the same to me. Theme and tone, which we're not really going to get into, but conflict wise, we have all these classic literary conflicts: man versus man, man versus nature, society, self, and God. These are traditional conflicts that have, someone once said there's only 7 actual stories, but everybody's been telling them in different ways forever, right? There's only 7. Some people say 5. Anyways, you remember those from high school. I'm not going to get into them, but they're everywhere. When you're developing your story, make sure that you have a beginning, a middle, and an end of some sort. One strategy to get your reader's attention is to begin in the middle. You can begin with a problem. You can tell how trouble escalates. For example, the first line of Gabriel Garcia Marquez's novel, 100 Years of Solitude, is this. That's the first line. So you're coming into the middle of things, right? Here comes the colonel. He's about to be shot, and he's thinking back about his childhood. You can also begin with a problem. In the beginning of a movie called A Fish Called Wanda, the robbers get caught. I think in Snatch it starts with a, no, that's a different one. You can talk about how the trouble escalated in Fight Club. The beginning of Fight Club is one of the characters is sitting there with a gun in his mouth, right? And then the story starts there, and then it flashes back to how the trouble escalated and you got to that point. You can also start a story with a particularly good line. Um, there are some famous first lines from literature. The first one is from Lolita, this by Vladimir Nabokov. The second one is the first line from the Stephen King movie, Stand By Me, where the little boys go out to poke a dead body. And then the last one is the first line from Goodfellas. You can also start with descriptions of a good character. This is arguably one. It's the first line of Charles Dickens' novel, David Copperfield. And then there's a play on it. Oopsie doopsie. There's a play on it here with J.D. Salinger's opening line from Catcher in the Rye. Then you've got Raiders of the Lost Ark, also as another example, the Indiana Jones movie. You got a great character there with Indiana Jones. You can also do a strange incident. That might hook your reader's attention. It's the first line of Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man by James Joyce. Just weird language. All it is a little boy walking down the road, really, but he manages to make it seem weird because he's James Joyce, and that's what he does. You can also draw out a really rich setting. This is the first paragraph of Age of Innocence by Edith Wharton. And kind of look over that. If you Google opening scene for Age of Innocence, you can see how Martin Scorsese turned this into a film. It's a fantastic movie. I highly recommend that one as well. You can also start your story with a character being in big trouble. Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom with a ball rolling down on him, running out of that temple. That's a great example. Or that's not Temple of Doom, that's Raider of the Lost Ark. Temple of Doom, where he's got it's the ice and the anecdotes of the poison he's just taken. That's pretty crazy in that nightclub. You can also look at the actual language that you use. One of my favorite opening lines of all time is Jack Torrance thought a fish's little prick. That's the opening line for The Shining, the novel by Stephen King. Right away, you can tell exactly who Jack Torrance is. He's pissed, right? Jack Torrance thought a fish a little prick. Like he's sitting there, he's dealing with someone who he thinks he's better than, and he's angry about it, right? And the Barabbas Came to Us by Sea by Isabel Allende. That's the opening line of House of Spirits. And then I got to take that Dickens off there. I'm over it. I'm kind of over that one. It's been a big famous line for a long time. Anyway, so these are just some ways to kind of jump into your writing to get you started for your photo story, which you guys are going to be doing. So I hope you got something out of that mini lecture, and I hope that you enjoy writing your photo story. Make sure you turn it in on time. Um, and that is all I'm going to give you for now. So have a good day. All righty.